Marcus felt the sharp sting of the wind bite at his skin as he pedaled down the street, the wet chill of early spring seeping through his jacket. His hands gripped the handlebars of the bike tightly, knuckles white, the old leather gloves barely protecting his hands from the cold. The smell of rain-soaked cardboard packages and damp paper clung to the air as he made his way through the narrow alleyway of the city's downtown. He could hear the creaking of his bike's rusty pedals with every turn, each rotation echoing the exhaustion that had built up over the years of delivering packages. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He should have been home, resting, maybe spending some time with his daughter, Jada. But here he was, riding through the grime of the city, facing the sting of rejection and prejudice at every corner. The city was a battleground for men like him. It had always been. He was used to the cold stares, the whispers behind his back. But today, it felt different. More suffocating, more painful. The weight of the world pressed on his chest. He had a delivery to make at a high-rise building just a few blocks away. His legs ached from hours of pedaling, but he pushed forward. The promise of a quick tip, a moment of kindness, maybe even a smile. Those were the small things he clung to, even when they felt so far out of reach. As he approached the building, he noticed a small group of well-dressed people standing near the entrance, chatting and laughing. He slowed, his pace as he neared them, hoping to avoid any more of the sneers or muttered insults that often came his way. One man, dressed in a tailored suit, looked him up and down with a smirk, before turning to his companion and muttering loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Another one of them, huh? Hope he doesn't mess up my package." The words stung, and Marcus' breath hitched in his throat. He swallowed hard, trying to push the hurt down. He wasn't a fool. He knew what it meant. He'd heard it before. He'd been around long enough to know how people saw him. A delivery man, a black man, just someone to be ignored, to be dismissed. The small group moved aside as Marcus approached, but no one made room for him. No one opened the door for him. The receptionist inside barely glanced up, muttering an apathetic greeting as she handed him a clipboard. "Delivery for Mr. Richardson," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, even as his hands shook slightly from the cold. She didn't look up from her screen. "Leave it by the desk," he nodded, turning to make his way down the corridor. But just as he was about to enter the elevator, a voice called out to him, "Hey, what are you doing? You can't just leave it there. I don't know you and I don't want anything from you." Marcus froze, the sting of the words hitting him harder than the cold wind ever could. He turned to see a woman standing at the door of an office, her arms crossed and her expression cold. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice faltering slightly. I don't want to hear it," she snapped, cutting him off. "I'm not taking anything from a—" Her voice trailed off, but Marcus knew exactly what she meant. It was a word that hung heavy in the air, one that she didn't even have to say for him to understand. His stomach twisted, but he didn't let the words show on his face. He placed the package down, nodded curtly, and turned to leave. The weight of the moment clung to him, the silent sting of rejection burning in his chest. He rode away, but the thought of the woman's words stayed with him. A black man not worth her time. For the rest of the day, Marcus went through the motions, making deliveries and pushing through the stares and comments that had become part of his routine. But the weight of the earlier encounter never left him. The streets were bustling with people going about their lives, but Marcus felt like he was invisible. It was a feeling he knew well, one that had been with him for as long as he could remember. But deep down in the quietest corners of his soul, Marcus believed that things could be different. He held on to something, a hope that one day things would change. As he pedaled home that evening, the sky darkening above him, Marcus whispered a quiet prayer under his breath. "Lord, help me. Help me find a way out of this pain." The city around him was full of noise and chaos, but in that moment, it felt like the world had gone still. The next day, Marcus woke up to the familiar hum of his alarm. It wasn't an easy start. His body ached from the day before, the weight of a long shift and an unspoken exhaustion that seemed to seep into his bones. He rubbed his face, the grogginess of the morning threatening to swallow him whole, but he forced himself out of bed. Jada would be up soon, and he had to be out the door before she did. He hated leaving her, even though he knew she understood. He slipped on his old jacket, the one with the fraying sleeves, and grabbed his helmet. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His bike, too, was barely hanging on, its rusty frame a constant reminder of how little he had to work with. It was hard not to feel small, invisible, when everything around him seemed to reinforce the message that he wasn't enough. But today was different. As he made his way down the stairs and onto the street, the city felt different. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the sidewalks in a dull grey. People hurried by, heads down, lost in their own worlds. But as Marcus began pedaling, the weight on his chest seemed to grow heavier with every turn of the wheel. He had a delivery at an upscale apartment complex today, the kind of place where the people inside had everything they wanted and more. It was a job he hated, but it paid, and that's all that mattered. He knew the drill: show up, leave the package at the door, get the hell out. But today, the nerves were already starting to settle in. It was all too familiar. When he arrived at the building, the doorman gave him a look of disdain, barely acknowledging his presence. Marcus forced himself to smile, to push past the hurt that was already threatening to rise up. He didn't have the luxury of getting angry. Not here. Not now. He couldn't afford to lose his job, his only source of income. But as he made his way to the elevator, the inevitable happened. A woman, dressed in an immaculate suit, stepped out of the elevator, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're not supposed to be here." Marcus blinked, taken aback. He didn't understand. "I have a delivery," he said, holding up the package, hoping that would explain everything. The woman didn't move. "I don't care. I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper. She didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she turned her head away, as though he wasn't even worth acknowledging. "You don't belong here," she muttered, her voice barely audible. The words cut through him. He couldn't lose his temper. He couldn't let her see how much it hurt. He needed the job. He needed to make it through the day. Without a word, Marcus placed the package down at the door and left the building. His breath came out in shallow gasps, and the anger, the humiliation, the rejection, everything he had been holding inside, threatened to explode. As he stepped back onto the street, the tears that he had been holding back began to blur his vision. He didn't cry in front of people. He didn't let anyone see how much it hurt. But that moment had broken something inside him. He rode aimlessly for a while, the weight of it all bearing down on him. His body ached. His legs felt like lead. But it wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked, how much he tried, there would always be someone who looked down on him, who saw him as less than. All he could think about was that woman's face, the look of disdain in her eyes, the feeling that no matter what he did, he would always be other. He stopped by a small park, the sound of traffic fading as he sat on a bench. The world felt cold, distant. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, trying to find some comfort in the silence. And then, as he sat there, something strange happened. It was peace. It was the feeling of someone else being there. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment it was, as if he wasn't alone. It was a stillness that settled in his chest, something quiet and calm that seemed to cut through the noise of the world around him. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to hold on to that feeling. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't do this alone, please help me." And as the words left his lips, something shifted inside him. A sense of hope, however small, began to grow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The following days seemed to bleed into one another, a blur of deliveries and hollow interactions. The sense of isolation that Marcus felt only seemed to grow. He'd become accustomed to the way people looked through him, like he didn't even exist, as though he were nothing more than the delivery man on his bike, just a face in the crowd. His legs ached more with every pedal, but it was the emotional exhaustion that was starting to take its toll. The constant rejection, the assumptions, the small, painful moments that chipped away at his spirit, it was all starting to weigh him down. But there was something different today. The sky was a pale, cloudy grey as Marcus rode through the streets of the city, the familiar creak of his bike echoing in the empty air. He had a delivery to make in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, a quieter part of town. As he approached the address, he saw a small, worn-out building tucked between two newer ones. It wasn't much, but it was a job, and he'd never refused a job, no matter how small or inconvenient. The door was an old wooden one, chipped and weathered, the paint peeling. Marcus knocked twice, his knuckles tapping softly on the wood. He waited. The seconds stretched into minutes as he stood there, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. There was a rustling sound from inside, and then the door creaked open slowly. An older man appeared in the doorway, his face lined with age but kind, his eyes tired but warm. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it much in a while. "Delivery for Mrs. Thompson," Marcus said, holding up the package. The man nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in. You're the first delivery in a while." As Marcus stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth of the small apartment. It was humble, but it had an inviting, lived-in feel. The man led him to the kitchen, where an older woman was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up, her face lighting up when she saw the package. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft but grateful. "I've been waiting for this." Marcus smiled, setting the package down in front of her. "No problem, ma'am." The man, who Marcus now assumed was her husband, watched him carefully, his eyes scanning Marcus as though he were trying to figure something out. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "You're working hard, huh?" he said, his voice gruff. Marcus looked up, caught off guard. "Yeah," he said, his tone quiet. "Long hours. A lot of deliveries." The man nodded. "I can tell. I used to work delivery too. A long time ago, though, before I retired." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Really?" The man smiled a little, his eyes distant. "Yeah. People don't see you when you're doing this kind of work. They don't think about the long hours, the cold days, the way people treat you. They don't see you as human." Marcus felt his heart tighten at the words. It was as if this man could see right through him, could understand everything he'd been going through. The man's wife, noticing the shift in the air, spoke up. "People can be cruel, but it's not about them. It's about you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You keep your dignity, no matter what they do or say." Marcus swallowed, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he could keep his dignity no matter what. "You're a good man," the man said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I can see it in your eyes." Marcus looked up, startled by the kindness. I don't know about that. Sometimes that's all we can do. Just keep going. But don't forget who you are." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this kind of kindness, this kind of understanding. It was a rarity, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. As he turned to leave, the woman called out to him, "Take care of yourself, son." It wasn't much, but it felt like a balm to his wounded soul. The words settled on him, like a gentle rain, washing away some of the bitterness that had been building up. He wasn't invisible here. He wasn't just a delivery man. He was a person, someone worth seeing. Marcus stepped back outside into the cold, but this time the wind didn't feel as harsh. The world still wasn't perfect, but in that moment it felt a little more bearable. He didn't have all the answers. He still didn't know how things would change, or if they would. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The following morning, Marcus woke up with a heaviness still weighing on his chest, but the warmth from yesterday lingered. It wasn't much, but the brief encounter with the elderly couple had made a difference. It was like a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself, a small opening, a light that had seeped through. Still, the world outside wasn't different. As he dressed and prepared for the day's deliveries, he reminded himself that the kindness he had experienced was rare. But the thought of those few moments of warmth stayed with him. Jada had already left for school by the time he stepped out of the apartment, her voice still echoing in his head as she had hugged him goodbye. She didn't understand the struggles he faced, not fully, But she was old enough to know that her father worked hard and that sometimes people treated him in ways that weren't fair. Marcus mounted his bike, feeling the familiar ache in his legs from the endless pedaling. But today, there was something different. The wind didn't bite as sharply as it usually did. His hands weren't shaking from exhaustion. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel completely defeated. The day was like any other. But as he made his way through the streets, something shifted. He stopped at a corner store to pick up a drink for himself, and when he walked to the counter to pay, the cashier, a young woman who had always looked at him like he was invisible, looked up and smiled. "Hey, Marcus," she said, her voice soft. "You doing all right today?" The question startled him. It was nothing big, just a simple acknowledgement of his existence, but it made him stop in his tracks. No one ever took the time to ask him how he was doing. He was just a faceless delivery man, always moving from one place to the next. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "Good. I'm glad. Take care of yourself out there." Marcus blinked, the kindness in her eyes unexpected and unfamiliar. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like maybe the world wasn't as indifferent as it had been the day before. When he left the store, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He still had a long day ahead of him, but the small moment of kindness lingered in his chest, like a spark in the dark. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. But as the day wore on, the familiar sting of prejudice was never far behind. He stopped at an upscale building to deliver a package, and as he approached, he saw a man walking out of the lobby. The man didn't even look at him, but his body language said everything. His shoulders were stiff, his stride purposeful. As he passed Marcus, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "Another one of them." The words hit him hard, like a slap across the face. It wasn't the first time he had heard those words. It wouldn't be the last. But something inside Marcus had snapped. The days of ignoring it, of swallowing the hurt, were starting to feel unbearable. He delivered the package without a word, but his hands trembled as he set it down. The sharp sting of injustice echoed in his chest, and he had to fight to keep from breaking down right there on the sidewalk. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to be the better person, it never felt like it was enough. Marcus stepped back onto his bike, the world around him seeming colder, darker. But then, as he pushed off the curb and began to pedal, away he heard a voice. "Keep going, Marcus." It was a quiet voice, but it felt like it was coming from deep inside him, from a place he hadn't acknowledged in a long time. A voice that seemed to know him better than he knew himself. Keep going. It wasn't a voice that had spoken to him in a dream or a grand vision. It was a voice that felt grounded in the moment, real. It was like a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. Marcus stood still for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. The courage to face another day, to ride through the pain and rejection and still keep moving forward. With a deep breath, he mounted his bike once more. The streets hadn't changed, the people hadn't changed, but something inside him had, and that was enough. The days that followed felt like a battle. There was a quiet strength inside him that had begun to take root. The voice that had spoken to him on that street, the voice that whispered, "Keep going," had stayed with him. It wasn't a loud, boisterous voice, nor was it the kind that demanded attention. But even with that newfound strength, the world around him had not changed. People still treated him like a shadow, an invisible worker who existed only to serve them. It was like he was constantly moving through a fog, and no one saw him, not really. That afternoon, Marcus made his way to an upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The last time he had been here, he had left the package at the door and been dismissed, without a word. The streets were quieter than usual as he approached the large house with its manicured lawn. He parked his bike and walked up to the front door, the sound of his boots on the steps breaking the stillness of the afternoon. Before he could knock, the door swung open. A woman stood there, her face frozen in an expression of surprise. She was well dressed, wearing a designer dress and a pair of sunglasses perched on her head, looking every bit the part of someone who was too busy to notice the world around her. Marcus hesitated, but the words he had been holding in all day came spilling out before he could stop them. "I've been to this address before," he said, his voice low but steady. "And every time, I'm treated like I'm invisible." The woman blinked, taken aback. She opened her mouth to say something, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I'm just trying to do my job. But every time it's like you're too good to even acknowledge I'm here. I'm just a delivery guy, right? Just someone who's supposed to be in and out, no questions asked." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It wasn't anger that fueled his words. It was something deeper, a quiet desperation, a longing for something more than this, something more than being seen as a nobody. The woman's face softened, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of something resembling recognition in her eyes. I'm sorry," she said after a long pause. "I didn't realize—" Marcus shook his head. "It's not about realizing, it's about respect. People like me, we're not seen until we're needed, but we're always here, working, struggling, just trying to make it." There was a long silence between them, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. Would she apologize? Would she dismiss him like the others? Finally, the woman stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Come in, please," she said, her voice softer now. "Let me make it right." Marcus hesitated, but he stepped inside anyway, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the house was quiet, and the air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and fresh flowers. It wasn't the kind of place Marcus felt comfortable in, but it was the kind of place that demanded respect, whether he liked it or not. The woman led him to the kitchen, where she placed the package down on the counter. "I know I've been rude before," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I've been caught up in my own world, and I never stopped to think about how hard your job must be." Marcus looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected an apology or even understanding. "I don't know what it's like to do what you do," she continued, her eyes filled with something like shame. "But I want to change that. I'm sorry for the way I've treated you." Marcus nodded slowly, not sure what to say. He had been ready for the usual dismissal, but instead he was faced with something he hadn't expected, an apology and a genuine attempt at making things right. She handed him an envelope. "Here's a tip," she said, "and if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Marcus took the envelope, surprised by the gesture, but there was something else in her eyes, something that told him this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about a tip or a package. It was about something more. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. Maybe people weren't all bad. Maybe not everyone saw him as less than. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for things to be different. As he left the house and stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun shone down on him, warming his skin. It wasn't a miracle, not by any means, but it was a small step, a small moment of change. The road ahead would still be hard. There would still be people who saw him as nothing more than a delivery man, someone to be overlooked. But there would also be moments like this, moments that reminded him he was more than the job he did, more than the man on the bike, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep him going. The morning after his encounter with Sarah Davis, Marcus awoke with a sense of purpose that had been absent for a long time. It wasn't that he had forgotten about the sting of prejudice, the subtle rejections, or the racial slurs whispered behind his back. Those things still haunted him. The thought of Sarah's apology stayed with him throughout the day. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a life-changing moment, but it was a shift. People didn't always have to be cruel. They didn't always have to disregard him. For the first time, he had been seen for more than just his job, for more than just the color of his skin. He had been acknowledged as a person. The day ahead was filled with the usual tasks, stopping at small shops, large office buildings, and upscale condos. But now, something had changed in him. He no longer felt like he was invisible. The quiet moments of kindness had shown him that there was more to his life than the hours spent on the streets. He stopped at a coffee shop on the way to his next delivery, hoping to grab a quick drink and clear his head. He wasn't offended. He was used to it. But it was still uncomfortable. As he stepped up to the counter, the barista gave him a warm smile. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone kind but neutral. "Just a coffee black," he said, his voice steady. The barista nodded, taking his order, but as she rang it up, Marcus caught the flash of something in her eyes. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment. It was something else, something soft, almost apologetic. It caught him off guard. "That'll be $2.50, she said, her voice quieter now. "I'll take care of it," she said, pressing a button on the register. "It's on me today." The words hit him harder than he expected, a small act of kindness, given without expectation, without strings attached. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. He had never been given anything for free, not like this, not by a stranger. The barista smiled. "It's just a coffee. Consider it a small gesture. The least I can do is return the kindness." Marcus blinked, his throat tightening. It was such a small thing, so simple, yet it meant more than he could express. He wanted to say something, but the words felt stuck in his chest. Instead, he simply nodded and smiled, the weight of the moment sinking in. As he stepped away from the counter, he felt a flicker of something deep inside him. It was a feeling of being seen, truly seen, not just as a worker or a delivery man, but as a person, as someone worthy of respect. He left the coffee shop, his cup of coffee in hand, and stepped back out into the street. The world hadn't changed. There would still be people who looked at him with disdain, who would treat him as less than. But today he had been given something rare. Today he had been treated with kindness, with dignity. The road ahead was still difficult. He still had a long way to go before he could escape the pain of the past, before the world would fully change its view of him. But as he rode through the city, the hum of the bike beneath him, he couldn't help but feel that, for once, things were shifting. The wind was colder now, but it didn't feel as biting. He could still hear the faint whispers, the murmurs of judgment from strangers, but they didn't pierce him as deeply as they used to. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was just a reflection of other people's prejudices. He was someone with his own worth, his own purpose. And maybe that was enough. For now, it was enough. It was just another day, just another package to deliver, just another block to ride down, another door to knock on. But as Marcus pedaled through the familiar streets, there was something different in the air, something quiet and steady that seemed to pulse with every turn of the wheel. It wasn't a change that could be seen, not yet, but it was something Marcus felt deep inside his chest, like a heart beating in rhythm with the world around him. But now it didn't feel as heavy. The words of Sarah Davis, the kindness of the barista, the old couple's quiet wisdom, they had all added up to something he didn't expect. Hope. The next delivery took him to a high-rise in the heart of downtown. It was an imposing building, tall and sleek, its glass windows reflecting the pale afternoon sky. As he rode up to the entrance, the usual nerves crept in. The doorman, the security guard, the elevators. He could already hear the familiar sounds of exclusion in his mind. He parked his bike and walked toward the entrance, his legs strong beneath him, his posture more confident than it had been in a long time. The doorman, a tall man in his 40s, nodded at him as he passed, but Marcus didn't look down. He didn't look away. He kept his head high, his eyes focused on the task at hand. The elevator ride was silent. As the doors closed, Marcus caught a glimpse of himself in the mirrored walls, his tired eyes, his worn clothes. But today, he didn't see the tired man who had been invisible for so long. He saw someone else, someone who had endured and kept going, someone who still had a place in this world no matter how small it felt sometimes. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped out into the lobby, where the usual barrage of stares and whispers awaited him. But something was different today. Today, he wasn't afraid of being seen. The woman at the front desk barely looked up as he approached. "Package for Mr. Grant," he said, his voice calm and steady. The woman sighed, barely giving him a glance. "Leave it over there," she said dismissively, motioning to the side. Marcus stepped toward the counter to place the package down, but before he could, a voice cut through the air. "Hold on." He turned, startled. Standing in front of him was a man, mid-30s, with sharp features and a look of authority. The man wasn't the typical building resident who would brush him off without a second thought. He wasn't dismissive, like the others. His expression was serious, but there was something in his eyes, something that told Marcus this wasn't going to be like the other encounters. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met," the man said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've seen you come and go for months now, and I never got the chance to properly introduce myself. I'm Nathaniel Grant." Marcus blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. People didn't usually introduce themselves to him in this place. They usually ignored him or treated him like he didn't belong. I'm Marcus," he stammered, taken aback by the change in tone. "I'm just here to drop off a package." "I know," Grant said with a small nod, "but I've noticed you around, always on time, always working hard, and I think it's time someone said thank you." Marcus was stunned into silence. Thank you? No one had ever said thank you, before, not in this place, not for the work he did. The man continued, his voice steady but warm. "And I know no one sees that. No one acknowledges it. But I want you to know that I do. That your hard work doesn't go unnoticed." Marcus felt the lump in his throat grow bigger, his chest tight with emotion. Was this real? Was this really happening? "I've been where you are," Nathaniel continued, his voice softer now. "I know what it feels like to be invisible. But you're not invisible to me. You're doing important work, and I appreciate it." The words hung in the air between them, each one like a thread that began to untangle the knot in Marcus's heart. He had expected rejection, as he always did in these buildings, but instead, he had been met with something he hadn't expected: respect. Thank you," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice thick. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Nathaniel said with a small smile. "Just know that someone sees you, and someone appreciates you, that's enough." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't going to change the world, but it was a moment of truth, a recognition that he wasn't just the invisible man on the bike. He was more than that, and maybe that was the most powerful thing he could take with him. As he left the building and stepped back onto the street, the world felt a little different. He had been seen, and that was a truth no one could take away from him. He rode down the street with a newfound strength, his bike carrying him through the city, the familiar creak of the pedals now a sound of victory. The road ahead would still be filled with struggles, but now Marcus knew he wasn't alone. And that knowledge, that truth, made all the difference. The next few days felt like a blur to Marcus. He kept his head down and continued with his deliveries, but the encounters from the past week lingered in his mind. The words of Sarah Davis, the kindness of the barista, the unexpected gratitude from Nathaniel Grant. They were small moments, but they had ignited something within him, a sense of dignity, a quiet strength that he hadn't known he had. But the difference now was that those moments didn't pierce him the mind.